Hey guys, so this is my daily challenge that I've set myself to win one game per day, and I'm playing against a player who's rated a bit lower than me, don't know the exact rating, and we've got the standard opening on the board, and I'm going to go ahead with the Scotch. So I think this looks like a 15 plus 10 or something like that. I just grabbed it out of open challenges, and we've got a fairly quiet d6 now on the third move, so got the option to push my d-pawn to d5, kicking the knight. If it goes back in front of the king, that's not great. It can't go really to d4 because there's two attackers, and we have these squares as well, which I could. There we go, so he's gone back in front of the king, so he's already starting to trip over himself a little bit here. Got the option of bringing the bishop out, maybe to g5, pinning the knight, which might prompt a pawn move, kicking the bishop, or I could just develop my knight to c3. That looks fine, this bishop isn't getting out anytime soon. So my goal here is to use my time, look for tactics. Now bishop to g5 looks more interesting because it's developing and it can't be kicked by the f-pawn. Could be kicked by the h-pawn, but then I can capture the knight, prompting a pawn recapture, and that really messes up black's king side. That's an interesting move. So he's done a discovered defense, and still that king side is looking solid, so that was a decent move by my opponent. I've got bishop b5 check, but then he's got a few options. He can block with a pawn, that's no good because then pawn takes, bishop takes, and he's forked with the king and the rook. If bishop comes out, he can block with the bishop. He can't block with the knight. So if bishop out, I think bishop out is the only likely scenario. Then if I capture the bishop and queen captures, I can maybe take the knight and mess up his pawns there. Let's try that. I don't really want to trade off my dark squared bishop cheaply. Okay, there we go, bishops come out. Another option is bishop takes, and then if queen takes, bishop takes forces his king to move. That's an alternative move order. Or I could just keep the tension with this bishop here. But then that prompts the question, what was I doing moving my bishop out there in the first place? I have to move it away, or I don't have to move it away, I guess it's defended by the knight. Could I develop my queen so that if bishop takes, queen takes, this pawn is defended? Anyway, that knight is pinned anyway, so queen to d3 is an idea. I'm now close to completing development, and black is still a little way away. So, right, it's kicking the bishop, slightly weakening move, weakens the light squares, but my bishop's stuck behind my pawns on this side of the board. See, because I've got pawns on light squares, it means that my dark squared bishop is potentially my better bishop. But still, if bishop takes and queen takes, bishop takes, king takes, he's lost castling rights, it's going to slow him down more, and I've got a fork with the queen, so let's try that. So I'm expecting queen takes, okay, and now bishop takes, king takes, and I've got queen to b5. Okay, queen to b5. Looks good. If he pushes his pawn, I can capture on b7 with check. Alright. So that's not bad at all. Now the question is, which way to castle? And also, do I have attacks here? So I'd like to get a knight up here. Maybe looking at d7, but that's not possible because of the dark squared pawns. Maybe castling is the right move now. This dark squared bishop's going to be problematic for black. Can't really get out into the game. This is the most likely, looking down here, which would suggest that maybe queenside castling is not going to be ideal. Can't move this pawn because it undefends that knight. I could reroute the knight round. It's a possibility. I'm tempted to castle queenside. And I can move my king over to maybe b1 off the dark squares. And maybe even move my rook over to c1 lined up with the king. Kingside castling does look like a slightly safer option. But that is the side of the board that his queen is on. We've got these blocked off pawns in the middle, which is going to make it slightly more challenging for his queen to get around. Queen can't go there either because of the knight. So I'm going to follow my instincts and go queenside castling. Focus my attention here. Right, the knight's come in. There is a loose pawn. I'm not concerned about the knight going to either of these two squares. But if I move the g-pawn and then the knight moves out of the way, this knight is undefended. But then, yeah. So let's figure this out. So let's say knight moves to there. Okay, that's not an option. G3, and his knight moves back. The queen is now looking at an undefended knight, and behind it an undefended pawn, which I think might prompt my queen to have to come back. Let's say queen e2. Is that a bad thing? So we've got his knight on the edge of the board. No, it looks alright to me. Knight could come in there also. I'm thinking now, queen e2 looks solid. Another option actually could have been knight back to e2, prompting the exchange because it's defended by the queen. The knight and the queen are his only active pieces right now. The rooks are still on their starting squares and this bishop is surrounded by its own pawns. Okay, so knight comes out to h3. So now the queen's attacking my knight and the knight's attacking there, so I think that's my only option really. I'm okay with that. Knight comes back, it gets taken by the pawn. And actually my knight now has h4 as a safe square and then possibly f5. King's on his travels again. I could check again, but then he'll just go back there, so that achieves nothing. I can't move this knight right now either because he'd have two attackers against f2. So maybe rook h to f1. Looks good. So he's still got over 15 minutes, so he hasn't even been using 10 seconds per move so far. Okay, we've got two undefended pawns. My knight could come in and have a poke. My queen can't move right now because this knight would be undefended. So maybe I should think about moving this knight. Maybe there, leaving me pretty solid. That's another idea. Could prompt a pawn push. Let's move the knight back here. I think that looks alright. Can now think about moving my pawns up, maybe even, is f4 possible? No, not really, no. Because with f4 he's got 1, 2, 3 potential attackers. Okay, he's moved his king back again. Okay, so the rook move was there, he's done an artificial castle. Queen e3 hits that pawn. So does knight b5. Queen e3 would probably prompt b6, which is weakening for sure. Alternatively, knight to there might prompt a6, which is similar. f3 is an idea. At least it takes it out of the line of fire of the knight. I think that's solid. Because now the knight's not on it and it's actually defended 3 times. I'm still feeling a bit ropey today. And when you are in this kind of state, if you're maybe off colour, brain's maybe not working at full tilt, then it's a good idea to practice the discipline of just slowing down again. Okay, I've got thoughts now. I'm just looking at f4. Because if pawn takes, I'd have queen g4 check, hitting the king and the knight. The queen can't break that because both of these 2 squares are covered by pawns. If f4, he's not going to take with the knight because I lose the knight. So if pawn takes, yeah, let's try that. Oh, he could also take with the e pawn. Is that an issue for me? Because he has actually got 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers on that square. I don't. Let's say that takes. Then he's got knight takes and all kinds of things. So maybe I want to keep things solid down this end. G4 is an idea. Gives me a backwards pawn. Or just a simple queen to g2 attacking the knight. Might be defended by the pawn. But in that case I can capture the pawn with an attack on the queen. Let's look at this. Pawn moves. I capture with an attack on the queen. Queen's forced to move. Looks alright. And also the pawn behind it is undefended. Queen has to get off the f-file. What if queen goes here? It's hitting the pawn. Then I can move my rook up actually and attack the queen. So possible moves for the queen. It's got 4 squares. Oh, well, that's a surprise, because that blunders the knight. Surely it does. Queen can't recapture. Pawn can recapture. Good old-fashioned blunder. Okay, now I'm thinking maybe doubling up my rooks. So we've got now doubled pawns and isolated pawns on the f-file. Don't think there's any scope for my knight to come in, really. Another idea, queen h3, and then g5 hits the queen. So queen h3, g5 comes with check, and the queen can't break the check because of the pawns. Looks like a slightly cheap tactic, but what's black got right now? Still a very bad bishop, can't go anywhere. Rooks aren't particularly powerful. This pawn cannot be defended by another piece, so I'm going to go with a rook lift, I think. Rook lift, double up the rooks, and I've still got this idea. So I'm a full minor piece in front. Black has 1 bishop, which is bad. I have 2 knights that are fairly active in defensive roles, but could come in later. I've still got an attack, maybe against a7. The queen is the only defender of this pawn, and it would take 2 moves, and that's one of them, to bring in another one. So if I bring my rook across now and pawn takes, I can actually recapture with the queen with check, so I think that looks alright. Or I could just capture with the rook and attack the queen. This is a nice in-between move. Queen can't block, king has to move. It's a pawn. This pawn's now undefended, so I need to be careful about my back rank. I do have at least knight to d1 to block any rook ideas. Okay, still 3 material points up. I don't see any reason not to capture the pawn on f4, putting me slightly ahead again. But do I capture with the rook or the queen? If I capture with the queen, it means the queen's defending h2, and it prompts an exchange, which is only going to be in my favour. If I capture with the rook, then the queen's going to have to move. It could move to here. I'm going to capture with the queen, because that takes off, these 2 squares are now unavailable for the black queen. I'll just swap off and then win this pawn. So the queen's got problems now, can't go there or there. So the queen could go here maybe. Okay. Okay, so he's won a pawn back that way. But he's going to lose f7 anyway. And then possibly, if this rook captures, then the bishop is at risk as well. And I'm safe from back ranks right now with that knight d1. So I'm expecting rook takes. If not, I may just drop back with the rook to defend it. Got rook to h1 as well if I need it. This is a possibility. Yep, okay. Now the king's defending the knight. I can grab a free pawn, or I can drop the rook back, defending both the knight and h2. Which is the better move? I'm going to play solid. I'm going to drop the rook back. My pawns are quite secure in the middle of the board. This pawn is always going to be a weakness. This pawn is a weakness for me. Maybe I should think about moving my king onto a light square. Is d1 preferable or b1? Okay, there's a fork. Yeah, if I move my rook there, and then rook takes that pawn, then this king has two attackers. So that's not ideal. Maybe rook here. Hits the bishop, puts the question to the bishop, and the pawn's still defended. Multi-purpose move. So it's good for black that he's managed to activate this bishop. But he's at material disadvantage now. I've also got maybe even knight to d1 as well. Okay, the bishop's just retreated. Knight's pinned still. I feel like these knights want to get a bit more proactive in the game. Tempted to play king b1. I'm going to have to make quicker moves. I'm going to play king d2 just to keep it near my knights, and I don't want it. I want to avoid back rank possibilities by getting trapped behind those three pawns. So I have to move quicker now. Alright, now that's good. Does two things: defends the pawn, attacks the bishop. Bishop can't move there, or there, or there, or there. So bishop's only got two squares. How can my other knight get in the game? Need to move the rook first, I think, so that my knight can come here, here, here. Okay, time to move the rook. Move it back here. Could get kicked again by the bishop. Got to watch out for time. I have got a 10-second increment, which I might need to use. If bishop comes back, I'll just go back to e2. So I'm nearly 10 minutes behind on time, but the increment could help me. Because I'm higher rated, it's likely that I should be able to maybe move quicker than my opponent if things get tight, but they're unlikely to get tight for him. He's got 13 minutes left on the clock. So it's all about just making careful moves. I might even try and bring my king up into the game. His pawn's defended twice, that's good. And generally you can see now, because there's a dark square bishop on the board, I want to keep most of my pieces on the light squares. So I've got all the main ones on light squares now. Okay. I'm starting to trip over myself a bit. He's controlling these dark squares pretty well. Let's move this rook. Maybe come up and attack this pawn. I need to coordinate better, but this bishop's doing a good job of covering these squares. Right, that's not a major threat. Let's put a fork in. If I do that, bishop here is likely, so maybe that's not the best move. One attacker. Let's go ahead with this idea. Or would that prompt the same move? Oh no, it gets covered by the knight. Okay. There. Bishop can't go here or here because of knights. So putting my knights on light squares makes sense, because when a knight, every time it moves, so this knight can only move to dark squares, right? So the more dark squares I cover, the fewer squares there are for his bishop. So ideally I want to get my other knight also onto a light square. Two defenders to attackers, that's okay. Alright. Rook cross onto light squares, now that pawn's alright. This pawn's still defended by the knight. And then knight can come to e2, putting more pressure on that bishop. So if my knight's there, I'm going to be covering a lot of the dark squares. And these rooks, you notice now, because my rooks are doubled, these rooks cannot come off the back rank. Because I've got a rook in there forcing move, I'm either going to capture and checkmate, but if rook captures, I've got rook captures and checkmate. So either way, those rooks are now tied to the back rank, which is good news for me. So I'm definitely looking now at knight e2. Okay, he's given himself an escape square, that's sensible. So he's reading my mind. So now I've got a lot of dark squares covered by my knights, an awful lot of dark squares. Which means this old bishop is starting to run out of options. My rooks are still doubled, that's a good thing. Okay, I'm going to simplify. Not going to think about that. That bishop's been causing me problems. We're getting towards the end of the game, and bishops can be more powerful towards the end of the game. So, still on over 3.5 minutes. These rooks are still fairly tied, not so tied as they were before. Maybe it's time to improve my knight. Where does my knight want to be? If I could pick this knight up and move it anywhere on the board, that's a nice square. So how can it get there? Let's think 1, 2, I want to get to here. Okay, so it's, no I don't, I want to get to here. So that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that safe? Yep, the pawn's safe, covered by the rook. How about rook there? I think I might just run my king to safety first of all. That's not a bad move actually. It's defended by the pawn, and it's defending my backwards pawn on e4, my rearmost pawn. Okay, that's alright. That's not deadly. So 1, 2, 3, 4 moves to get my knight to that nice square. For rook a1 I've got a4. Could force an exchange of rooks at this point, which will only be in my favour. To his advantage, all black's pawns are together, which means the king can, well, the king is defending the entire pawn structure because these ones are defending each other. Okay, so he spotted that. Right. Okay, let's start my knight manoeuvres. Knight to here also protects that square, that's alright. So the idea is there, there, there with check and protected, with options then of maybe even coming to e7 with forks and stuff like that. Putting a threat against a7, right, that's not a threat, don't have to worry about that. There's no forking opportunities for my knight right now. You can't bring your rook into there because of the knight. I'm going to just shuffle my king away to safety anyway. He's got a cheapo check, but if so, I just move king to b2. I'm safe. I want to keep this rook probably on the 7th rank because it's doing a good job just defending these pawns. That's not any trouble for me. I'm going to bring my knight in just to increase the sense of danger. Opponent's playing some decent moves, has to be said. I'm going to bring my rook back to cover this square. There is now a potential fork. Unlikely to happen, but it might be worth a stab. At least it makes my opponent have to respond. Okay, he's not gone for that. I'm just going to play a4. Let's move back. He has to respond to this now. Put my knife on a safe square. Also blocks the open file. Okay, I'm not going to get suckered into any repetition ideas. I'm now up to 4 minutes after making some fairly swift moves. Can I attack this with a knight? I can if I go here first, then to here, and then I've got an idea of bringing a rook up with 2 attackers on that pawn. Still at 4 minutes, he's down to 11. Knights can be pretty sneaky now. You've always got to watch your back for forks. There are more knight forks than any other type of fork. They are fork specialists. Okay, this is dual purpose. It kicks the rook and it adds an attacker to c7. If the rook moves, then he hasn't got time to do anything else about this, so attack there. He's going to be forced to move his rook back to c8 now. Oh, well, that's an error, because that comes with check. King can't go there, there. He's got one move. He's got to move back to here. Now I might just drop my rook back into the pocket here. Yes, I'm threatening this pawn. It also protects the knight if my knight ever goes into c7 there. I may also sacrifice this pawn and get this rook up into the game. Look for a checkmating opportunity. He's got to be careful about forks because this knight is one move away from forking that. Oh. A5 with check. How about that? Can't see any reason not to do that. This pawn is now a goner. Right, so the king has to be careful. Okay. Got 2 ideas. I mean, that's possible as well. Let's go in for the kill. Okay, he's got 2 squares he can go to, and he mustn't go to a8 because fork. So he's got to go to b8. That's a danger square. Either way, this pawn's gone. And then a5 will follow pretty soon after. It's nice that this rook is also defending c3. And that would be a mistake. I mean, just capturing on h2 is immaterial to the outcome of this game. Okay, this is a no-brainer. You've got to play king b8. Mistake. Okay. I'm not going to pre-move. He's got 3 squares he can go to, but either way, these 2 mean that I capture with check, so that is the better move. Unless there's an in-between, there is. I can... Okay, so here's a very good thing to remember, right? Even if you think there's an obvious capture, for example, then I'm swapping a knight for a rook, but if I do this, then I get... No, yeah, no. Whew, knight's defended. Okay, I do this. I grab the pawn with check, and I can still, because it comes with check, the king has to move, and now I capture the rook with check, and I'm not losing my knight. So much better for me. All right, now let's grab the pawn. There isn't a checkmate, is there? Not yet. Let's grab the pawn. So the king's got this square still. No, he hasn't. The king has no squares. So now we are in a situation of just my only objective is not stalemating my opponent. Okay. So I've got a couple of checks. That's one, that's one. Let's go for this one. It forces the king onto the back rank. Knight's undefended. No, it's not. Rook's defending it. Okay, and as long as you keep checking, there can be no stalemate, so that's a useful principle. I'd like to get this knight onto a square where it's defended by a pawn. I'm getting close to checkmate now. I think that's the only square now. Now is that checkmate? I think so. Yes. Whew. So only 2 points, but it's 2 points. And you can see how, because maybe I'm not feeling on top form, and yes, I was playing a weaker opponent, but there are always risks to playing a weaker opponent. But even so, you can notice how I was very, very careful to think through my moves, to think, if this, then what? You know, to calculate. I had time to do it, and I used my time. My opponent has finished with 10 minutes on the clock. I finished with 4 minutes on the clock, but a result's a result. So I hope that was interesting for you to follow this through in real time, and I'll see you next time.